All right, I am going to show you a process for factoring called factor by grouping. So one of the first things you're going to notice is when you're doing factor by grouping, typically you have four terms. And so what do I mean by factor by grouping? Well, you're going to take the first two terms and you're going to group them. And you can group them by putting parentheses around them. Then you're going to take the second two terms and you're going to group those by putting parentheses around those. Now, here's what I want you to do. I want you to look at the terms that you have inside of the first group. Do they have any numbers in common? Meaning, do you have any number that will divide into both of these? Do you notice that both of these numbers are divisible by 5? So because of that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to write that pair and I'm going to take out a 5. Think of it as reverse distributing. Instead of multiplying the 5 in, we're going to take the 5 out through division. Now, actually, they have something else in common. Do you notice how this one has a squared and this one has a to the third? So I can take 2a's from both of them. So actually, what these two terms have in common is a 5a squared. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take it out using division. 25 divided by 5 is 5. And I had a to the third, but I took two of them out, so I'm left with just 1a left. So that's me taking out 5a squared. But what about this one? 5 divided by 5 is 1. A squared, I took out the full a squared, so that's what I'm left with, 5a plus 1. And if you want to double check if you did that correctly, imagine that you are distributing it back in. If you were to distribute it back in, it should take you back to the original. So that's what we're doing. We're basically doing reverse distributing. Now, let's check this one. Do you see something in common we have between these two? Is there something that both of these terms are divisible by? Both of them are divisible by 6. Now, one thing I want to point out is that this first term is negative. So because of that, if that first term in that group is always, if it's negative, always take the negative with it. So yes, there's a 6 in common, but I'm actually going to go ahead and pull that negative 6 out. So let's give it a try again. We're going to divide each term by negative 6. So negative 30a divided by negative 6 is a positive 5a. Negative 6 divided by negative 6 is a positive 1. So we pulled out that negative 6 from these two terms. Again, if you want to double check, imagine that you are redistributing that back in. You should get back to the original problem. But here's the cool part. Take a look at what I have. Do you notice something interesting? I personally find it interesting that this 5a plus 1 matches this 5a plus 1. And that's what you actually want to see happen. When you're doing factor by grouping, you want to have a matching pair because that ends up being your first factor. Now, what about your other factor? Do you see anything else that we can put together in the other factor? It's whatever's left over. The 5a squared is left over and the negative 6 is left over. So what you're going to do is write them together inside the next factor. And there are your factors for factor by grouping. You can always double check to see if you did it correctly by double distributing it to see if it takes you back to this original. Now, I want to show you though that double distributing or the factor by grouping method also works for a problem like this. Now, earlier we did factoring with 3 terms, but it only worked if that leading coefficient was 1. Now, we've also seen numbers where if that leading coefficient is not 1, you can just divide it out, kind of like what we did over here. But notice that these 3 terms do not have something in common. So how should we do it? Well, we can actually use factor by grouping by turning this problem of 3 terms into a problem of 4 terms. So here's how I'm going to do that. I'm going to use my X method. I've shown you this before. I am going to go ahead and say what 2 numbers will multiply to give me this top value and will add to give me this bottom value. Well, normally the last number is that multiplying number. But because we have a front number here, we have to actually combine that front number with that last number. So I kind of make it look like it's a pair of glasses. You see the glasses there? I multiply those 2 terms. So the front number times the last number, 3 times negative 4, is actually going to be the new multiplying number. The addition number is still going to be that middle term. It's still going to be that -4. So what I'm looking for is two numbers that will multiply to give me -12, and they will add to give me -4. So what do you think? 12, start thinking of all the factors. If you have to, draw your little chart. 12 is 1 and 12, it's 2 and 6, and it's 3 and 4. In fact, I have to have a negative somewhere, and because my B term is negative, my bigger values are negative. Do you see which of those pairs will give me a -4? Hopefully you're noticing that it's the 2 and the -6. So I'm going to put a 2 here and a -6 here. Now we're not going to go to the factors quite yet. What we're going to do this time is we're going to use these two numbers that we know add up to -4, and we're going to take that middle term, -4, and we're going to split it to 2m minus 6m. We're going to use those two numbers to split this up. Don't you agree that 2m minus 6m will just take me back to this? And so then what I'm going to do is take the front term and bring that back down, 3m squared. And then I'm going to take that -4, bring that down. And notice that I just turned my 3-term polynomial into 4 terms. Now why do I do that? Because of factor by grouping. Now that it's 4 terms, I can group my first two, I can group my second two. And let's use the factor by grouping process. What do these first two terms have in common? Well, all I really see is an m. So let's go ahead and just pull out an m. When I pull out the m, I'm left with 3m plus 2. And then what about these two terms? Well, I see a negative, so I know I'm going to take a negative with it. But I also realize they're both divisible by 2. So if I take a 2 out, -6 divided by -2 is 3m. -4 divided by -2 is a +2. Hey, and what do you know? I've got a matching pair. That matching pair is your first factor. And what about your remaining pair? M minus 2? Well, that's your other factor. And that's how you can use factor by grouping in two different types of problems. I hope that was helpful.